Have you ever wondered who the little horn is in Daniel chapter 7? Well, guess what? After today's video, you're no longer going to have to wonder. Today, we're going to reveal who this little horn represents. Let's get to it. Hi, I'm Torrey St. Cyr. Welcome to The Clear and Present Truth. Before we go into today's study, I want to remind you that if you find value in this content and you want to see more content similar to this, please like this video, subscribe to this video, and even if possible, share it with your family and friends. All right, now let's get down to business. Now, just like the format, and this is sort of a review so that we can get down to the heart of the matter here. So let's review. Now, remember, there was a statue in Daniel 2 that featured 4 different metals. We also remember that the prophecy in Daniel 7 featured a prophecy with 4 different beasts. We recognize that the metals in Daniel 2 and the beast in Daniel chapter 7 represent the same world empires. And they are the Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, and the Roman Empire. Now, just like the statue or the 10 toes in Daniel chapter 2 on the feet of the image saw an infiltration or the rise of a new power coming into play, Daniel chapter 7 repeats and expounds on this entity that rose up within the Roman Empire. And it expounds on that in verses 7 and 8. Notice what the Bible says in Daniel chapter 7 and verse number 8. After this, I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth. It devoured and brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Now, just as the 4th metal in Daniel chapter 2 featured 10 toes, the 4th beast in Daniel chapter 7 featured what? 10 horns. Now notice what verse number 8 says. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of man, and a mouth speaking great things. Now check it out, ladies and gentlemen. Just like the feet and toes of iron in Daniel chapter 2 were infused with clay, the 10 horns in Daniel chapter 7 were infiltrated by a little horn. But this begs the question then, what is the little horn? Now, in order to understand who the little horn is, we first need to answer the question, what does a horn represent in Bible prophecy? For this understanding, we're going to turn to Daniel chapter 7 and verse number 24. The Bible says, and the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise. Now, before we move any further here, I want to make a distinction that I'm not going to fully explain in this video, but I promise I'll explain it in a future video. But for now, you just have to take it on faith, okay? I need you to understand that when the Bible says, now the Bible says 10 horns, and it gives us the impression that each horn represents one king. So one horn would be equal to one king. But I want to make sure that you understand today that when the Bible says horn, a horn represents a line of kings. A horn represents a monarchy of kings. A horn represents what I call a kingship. What is a kingship, you might ask? A kingship represents all the kings that ruled a territory or kingdom, okay? Now, let me give you an example. If this, let's just say for an example, if this 4th beast was the United States of America, the horn on this beast would represent all, we don't have kings in the United States of America, but just roll with me on it. The little horn on the 4th beast, if it was the United States of America, would represent all the presidents beginning with George Washington all the way to the current president today, which is Joe Biden. So all the presidents combined together would be represented as one horn. Now that we understand the definition of a horn, now we must determine what does the little horn represent in Daniel chapter 7. Now, if you remember, in my video on Daniel chapter 2, we talked about the 10 toes, and we talked about the clay that was infused among the 10 toes, and we said that that clay represented the papacy. Well, if the clay that was infused with the 10 toes represented the papacy, obviously the little horn that rose up among the 10 horns in Daniel chapter 7 would also represent the papacy. But now here is where we have to be really careful. Even though the little horn represents the papacy, what you must understand is that God gives the little horn all the attributes of the pagan kings before the papacy was established. In other words, the little horn doesn't just represent the papacy. The little horn also represents the consuls, the kings, and the emperors who ruled the Roman Empire before the papacy was even established. All of them together represent the little horn who, according to verse 20, became stout or great. Now remember, in our previous study, we said that a beast equals a king or a kingdom. But now here's the problem. In this prophecy, the horns also represent kings. And it's unlikely that the beast would represent a king, and then the horns on the beast would also represent a king or kings. So therefore, ladies and gentlemen, we conclude here that it is likely that the beast in this prophecy represents the territory or the kingdom, and the horn represents the kings that ruled said territory. So therefore, we understand that the fourth beast represents the Roman Empire, and the little horn represents all the consuls, all the kings, all the emperors, and ultimately the popes who wielded power within the Roman Empire. Now that we understand who the little horn is, verse 24 tells us the story of the little horn before it transitioned to papal Rome. Notice what verse number 24 says. And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall rise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings. Now here is where we need to recall the previous video that I did on Greece. And here is also why it's important that we understand the symbols that came before this fourth world power. Now, if you remember, after Alexander the Great died, the Greek Empire was divided into 4 different territories. Asia Minor in the north was ruled by the Lysimachine kingship. Syria in the east was ruled by the Seleucid kingship. Egypt in the south was ruled by the Ptolemaic kingship. And finally, Macedonia in the west, who was ruled by the Casandarian kingship, was conquered or later conquered by the Antigonid kingship. Now, these were the 4 kingships that ruled the known world at that time. But here is what you need to understand. History says that the Seleucid kingship conquered Asia Minor in the north. So now, ladies and gentlemen, there's only 3 kingships left. You have the Seleucid kingship, who now controls the north and the east. You have the Antigonid dynasty, or the Antigonid kingship, who rules in the west. And you have the Ptolemaic kingship, who rules in the south. Now there's only 3 kingships left. And now we must understand, and here's where we must understand, that in order for Rome to conquer the known world, it had to conquer the 3 remaining kingships of the Greek Empire. And what did the Roman kings do? Verse number 24 tells us that the little horn shall subdue 3 kings. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, the little horn, or the Roman Empire, or the kingships of the Roman Empire, they came out of the west, conquering the Antigonid dynasty. Then they came to the east, conquering the Seleucid dynasty, and then they went south and conquered the Egyptian dynasty. Ladies and gentlemen, the little horn came and conquered all three of the remaining kingships of the Greek Empire. Clearly, the papacy wasn't ruling the empire when these kings were conquering the known world. Not only weren't they ruling, but they weren't even in existence when pagan Rome was conquering the known world. That's our indication, ladies and gentlemen, that the little horn is inclusive of the pagan kings who ruled the empire. In essence, God sees the papacy as simply a continuation of all the kings who ruled the empire from times past. But you must understand that the plucking up of these three horns occurred under the pagan phase of the little horn. Now, verse 25 quickly transitions to the papal phase of the little horn. Notice what verse number 25 says. And he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and the dividing of times. Now, what is verse number 25 talking about? In order to know, we have to really understand how the papacy became the papacy. So let's go back. Now, we recognize that Christ established the Christian church. In Acts 11:26, the Bible says the disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. Notice, ladies and gentlemen, there were no denominations. They weren't called Catholics. They weren't called Methodists. They weren't called Seventh-day Adventists. They weren't called Presbyterians. They weren't called Pentecostals. They were simply called Christians. Now, what we must understand is that overseeing the Christian church were bishops, similar to what we would call an evangelist or pastor today. Now, understand, throughout the years, the role of the bishop increased over the years. But certain bishops gained bigger influence over other bishops. So bishops in places like Jerusalem, Antioch, Rome, Alexander, those bishops sort of became bishops over the other bishops. And they began to amass power, but all their power was contained within the church. Now, we fast forward to 313 AD. And Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, which legalized Christianity in the empire. You see, up until this point, Christianity wasn't a legal religion. But now, at 313, Christianity became a legalized religion. Now, understand, less than 70 years from the time Christianity became legalized, Christianity became the official religion within the Roman Empire. According to history, in 380 AD, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. So far, so good, right? Well, not exactly. You see, as Christianity became the official religion, what began to happen is the power of the bishops for the church began to move outside of the walls of the church. Now, what you must understand is that after a certain time, the Bishop of Rome became more important than all the other bishops. Now, what happened is the emperor moved the capital of Rome from Rome, the city, to Constantinople in the east. And when that happened, the Bishop of Rome became even more powerful, and he began to usurp authority over all the other bishops. It would kind of be like a pastor today would, if you had a pastor in every state within the United States, it would be like the pastor of the Washington, D.C. church would kind of take precedence over all the other pastors in all the other states. In that way, we can see that even though Rome was no longer the capital, Rome was still the center of the city of Rome was still the center of the Roman Empire, even though the emperor had moved the capital to Constantinople. Now it gets even more interesting, because in the 6th century, Emperor Justinian cemented the Bishop of Rome's power when he decreed something called the Code of Justinian. And the Code of Justinian, essentially what it did was it decreed that the Bishop of Rome was the head over all of Christianity. And ladies and gentlemen, it was at this point that the Bishop of Rome became what we know today as the Pope. You see, ladies and gentlemen, the current Pope today is Pope Francis. Pope Francis is nothing more than the Bishop of Rome. You see, they still usurp power over all the other bishops within the church. That's who they are. The popes are essentially the bishops of Rome, who claim that because we're in Rome, we're the bishops of the Roman city, of the city of Rome, we have more power over all the other bishops within the empire. And so even today in the Catholic Church, the Bishop of Rome, which is the Pope, has ultimate authority over all the church. But don't you see the problem, ladies and gentlemen? When Emperor Justinian legislated the Code of Justinian, it gave the Pope unbridled power. It gave the Pope absolute authority. And what do we say about absolute authority? Absolute authority corrupts absolutely. It's one of the reasons why in the United States of America, the President of the United States just can't do what he wants to do. He can't just do anything. He has checks and balances, because mankind understands that if you give a man power and you give him ultimate power, he will begin to legislate or give himself even more powers than what he originally had. And so therefore we understand that the Bishop of Rome became the Pope as we know today. Now, once the Bishop of Rome became the head over Christianity, verse number 25 tells us what he did with this power. And he, the papacy, shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and the dividing of time. So there's 4 parts to this text that I want us to look at and unpack. All right. The first thing is speaking great words against the Most High, then the wearing out of the saints, then the thinking to change times and laws, and then the time span of a time, times, and the dividing of times. Now, let's deal with the first component of this prophecy, and let's look at how it says speaking great words against the Most High. How did the papacy speak great words against the Most High? We must understand that the papacy began to take on prerogatives that only belong to God himself. Now, I'm going to show you that in this, I bought this book, The Convert's Catechism of Catholic Doctrine. Okay. Now, please understand that in page 28 of this book, here's what it says. Question: who is the Holy Father or Pope? Answer: the Holy Father or Pope is the visible head of the church, the successor of St. Peter, and the vicar, which that means representative or substitute, of Christ on earth. Now, what we must understand is that the Catholics consider their Pope Holy Father. But according to John 17:11, the Holy Father can only be God the Father. And it is in this manner, ladies and gentlemen, that the papacy spoke words against the Most High, because they took on the prerogatives that only would belong to God himself. Now let's talk about the wearing of the saints. When you get some time, I want you to look up something called the Catholic Inquisition. Around the 12th century AD, the papacy began to persecute all non-Catholics for heresy. And it were times, ladies and gentlemen, where people were persecuted, they were tortured, and all types of terrible things happened to people simply because they didn't believe as the papacy determined that they should believe. And therefore, they were persecuted. This, ladies and gentlemen, is one instance where the papacy wore out the saints of the Most High. Now let's deal with the thinking to change times and laws. Now, I want to make sure that you understand that this will be sort of a brief overview of this. I'll probably cover this in detail in a future study, but that's going to be a long ways off. So this will just be a brief mention in passing, okay? Now, what I want to make sure that you understand is that most Christian churches don't recognize the seventh-day Sabbath as having any validity for Christians today. What you must understand is that the reason that most Christian churches don't see this as binding upon all of Christianity, and they see it as sort of just something that are geared towards Jews, is because the papacy made everyone believe that these times had changed back in the time of Christ. Now, what I want you to understand is that early on in the Christian church, that Christians kept the seventh-day Sabbath. But what I want you to also understand is that eventually they began to keep the first day of the week, or what today we would call Sunday. They began to recognize Sunday as a celebration or memorial of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So ultimately, a lot of Christians would keep the Sabbath, but they would also look at Sunday as a day for a celebration for the resurrection of Christ. Now, I don't have a problem with celebrating the resurrection of Christ on the first day of the week. However, ladies and gentlemen, what you must understand is that after a time, the people of the empire begin to gravitate towards Sunday as the day not only to celebrate the resurrection of Christ, but also as an observance or a replacement for the seventh-day Sabbath. And as the centuries would roll on, the Christians begin to focus less and less on the seventh-day Sabbath, and they begin to put most of their focus on the first day of the week, which is Sunday. And more, the Sabbath became essentially a Jewish central day, and Sunday became a Christian central day, or as they call it today, the Lord's Day. Now, this is freely admitted by the Catholic Church. As a matter of fact, in their encyclopedia, here's what they have to say about it. The Church, on the other hand, after changing the day of rest from the Jewish Sabbath, or the seventh day of the week, to the first, made the third commandment refer to Sunday as the day to be kept holy as the Lord's Day. So, ladies and gentlemen, understand when the Bible says think to change times, that time is the seventh-day Sabbath, which was made believed to be changed back in the Middle Ages. Now, also in Converse Catechism, you'll realize that they took out the second commandment. The second commandment is a commandment that forbids worshiping or bowing down to idols. Now, most likely the reason why the Roman Catholic Church did this was because that in their worship services, they often bow down and pray to what they call saints, which essentially is idols of people that have died in the church or in the faith years ago. So you'll see different statues and images, and they'll bow down to them. Now, in fairness to Catholics, they say that they're just asking them to pray for them. They're asking them to intercede for them. And so when they pray to them, they're not really worshiping them. That's how they see it. But understand, ladies and gentlemen, the way I believe I see it, and I think the way the Bible sees it, and God ultimately sees it, is that when we bow down and when we're praying to people that have died, that is a form of worship. And so, ladies and gentlemen, this is how they not only took out the times or thought to change times, but here, when they removed the second commandment, they thought to change laws as well. Now let's deal with the time and times and half a time. Now, what you must understand is that this time frame is the time period that the papacy essentially ruled both church and state. All right. Now, when we look at the Jewish or the Hebrew year lasted 360 days. Okay. Now, so one time equals 1 year. So a time equals 360 days. Then times plural equals 2 years. So that's 720 days. Then a half a time is half of the 360-day year. So it's 180 days. If you put it together, it's 1,260 days or 3.5 years. Now, the problem that we're going to face here, ladies and gentlemen, is that according to history, the Catholic Church didn't rule or didn't last for just 3.5 years. The papacy ruled for a lot longer time than that. And here's where we must implement a biblical rule where we take a day for a year. Notice what the Bible says in Numbers 14:34. After the number of days in which ye searched the land, even 40 days, each day for a year shall ye bear your iniquities, even 40 years, ye shall know my breach of promise. Notice what Ezekiel 4 verse 6 says. And when thou hast accomplished them, lie again on thy right side, and thou shalt bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days. I have appointed thee each day for a year. Now, when looking at these two texts, it should be clear that the papacy didn't rule for 1260 days. They ruled for 1260 years. The 1260-year time frame began in the year 538 AD when Emperor Justinian placed the Bishop of Rome over the Catholic Church. Now, obviously, he legislated it about 5 years earlier, but it really didn't come into play until the year 538 AD. And the prophecy ended at the end of the 1260 years, which was the year 1798. In 1798, Napoleon captured the Pope and the Pope was exiled. Now, even though the church continued to operate and they would ultimately elect another Pope, the power that the church had over church and state began to diminish from that point forward. And so we see that the prophecy began in 538 AD and ended in 1798 AD, which is exactly 1260 years. Now, as we bring this study to a close, let's test you and see how much you've retained. According to the Bible, a horn represents a kingship or all the kings that ruled a nation. According to what you've learned today, the little horn represents who? The papacy, but not only the papacy, it represents what? All the consuls, all the kings, all the emperors who ruled the Roman Empire. The three horns destroyed by the little horn represent what three kingships? The Antigonid kingship in the west, the Seleucid kingship in the east, and the Ptolemaic kingship in the south. According to Daniel 7:25, what three actions did the papacy take against God? Well, according to the prophecy, he spoke great words against the Most High, which means he decreed prerogatives that only pertain to God. He wore out the saints of the Most High, which means he persecuted the saints. And number three, he thought to change times and laws, which he tinkered with the 10 Commandments. Now, before we close this video, I just want to say that if you're a Catholic or a non-Sabbath keeping Christian, this video was not meant to point you out, nor was it meant to offend you. We're simply looking at history and aligning it with Bible prophecy. But regardless where you are in your walk with God, I want to thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And now you know the clear and present truth of the little horn in Daniel chapter 7.